So everyone, welcome back to part 2 of this presentation on the case for Christ. The first part, which is a separate YouTube video, dealt with the eyewitness and the documentary evidence, looking primarily at the New Testament and their authors. In this section, or this presentation, we're going to be looking at the corroborative evidence and the scientific evidence, which are two topics dear to my heart, given the number of doubters around the gospel as a truly historic document as opposed to a theological one. So let's get cracking. Is there credible evidence for Jesus outside his biographies? And not a lot of people know how much information there is, but first let's look at the expert opining on this. Highly qualified, Edwin Yamaguchi has given many lectures, published many articles, written books, and has studied in 22 languages, and also participated in excavations. So let's see. First author who corroborates Christ is Josephus, a Pharisee. His most ambitious work was the Antiquities, history of the Jewish people from its creation until 93 AD. And this is the first example of corroboration for Jesus outside of the Gospels. He actually mentions Jesus and his cousin James. Here is corroboration of the fact that some people consider Jesus to be the Christ, which means the anointed one or Messiah. He convened a meeting of the Sanhedrin and brought before them a man named James, the brother of Jesus, who was called the Christ, and certain others. He accused them of having transgressed the law and delivered them up to be stoned. I know some of you are thinking that Jesus had a brother, which you didn't know. No, Jesus didn't have a brother. But in those days, first cousins were referred to as brothers. James was the first cousin of Jesus, son of his mother's sister. Josephus wrote an even lengthier section about Jesus called the Testimonium Flavianum, which on its surface appeared to provide sweeping corroboration of Jesus' life, miracles, death, and resurrection. About this time there lived Jesus, a wise man, if indeed one ought to call him a man, for he was one who wrought surprising feats and was a teacher of such people as accept the truth gladly. He won over many Jews and many of the Greeks. He was the Christ. When Pilate, upon hearing him accused by men of the highest standing among us, had condemned him to be crucified, those who had in the first place come to love him did not give up their affection for him. On the third day he appeared to them, restored to life, for the prophets of God had prophesied these and countless other marvelous things about him, and the tribe of Christians so called after him has still to this day not disappeared. This is actually a controversial passage, as it would appear to be slightly doctored, and that is the text in orange, because these are called interpolations, and it's thought that Josephus wouldn't have actually written those sections or phrases exactly like that. Probably Christian scholars doctored it after the fact, not because they changed the meaning or what he wrote, but he wouldn't have used that style to express himself. So early Christian copies probably inserted those phrases that a Jewish writer such as Josephus wouldn't have written. Nonetheless, no one's questioning the essence of that text. Then you have Tacitus. Now, Tacitus explicitly states that Nero persecuted the Christians as many scapegoats to divert suspicion away from himself for the great fire that had devastated Rome in AD 64. Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name has its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilatus, and a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out, not only in Judea, the first source of evil, but even in Rome. Accordingly, an arrest was first made of all who pleaded guilty. Then, upon their information, an immense multitude was convicted. No, not so much of the crime of firing the city as of hatred against mankind. So regardless of whether the passage was referring to crucifixion and subsequent resurrection or not, it does provide us with a remarkable fact, which is this: the abhorrence of crucifixion. It was really the most terrible punishment that anyone could undergo. It also provides important testimony by an unsympathetic witness to the success and spread of Christianity based on a historical figure, Jesus. And significantly, he reported an immense multitude held so strongly to their beliefs that they were actually willing to die rather than recant. How can one explain the spread of a religion based on the worship of a man who suffered the most ignominious, disgraceful death possible? Hardly someone one would hold up as a hero, worthy of worship. Let's see if there's another reference, and indeed, Pliny the Younger probably provides the most important reference that we can see. Much of his correspondence with his friend, Emperor Trajan, and it's been preserved. Book 10 of these letters refers specifically to the Christians he arrested. So, I've asked them if they are Christians, and if they admit it, I repeat the question a second and a third time with a warning of the punishment awaiting them. If they persist, I order them to be led away for execution. For whatever the nature of their admission, I'm convinced that their stubbornness and unshakable obstinacy ought not to go unpunished. They also declared that the sum total of their guilt or error amounted to no more than this. They had met regularly before dawn on a fixed day to chant verses alternately amongst themselves in honor of Christ, as if to a god, and also to bind themselves by oath, not for any criminal purpose, but to abstain from theft, robbery, and adultery. This made me decide it was all the more necessary to extract the truth by torture from 2 slave women, whom they called deaconesses. I found nothing but a degenerate sort of cult carried to extravagant lengths. Quite severe, this gent. Attests, however, the passage does attest to the rapid spread of Christianity, both in the city and in the rural area, amongst every class of person, slave women as well as Roman citizens, since he also says that he sends Christians who are Roman citizens to Rome for trial. It talks about the worship of Jesus as God, that Christians maintained high ethical standards, and that they were not easily swayed from their beliefs. This then is an extremely important reference, as I stated. Now, here's an interesting one. If you've read the gospel, you'll know that as Jesus hung on the cross, it's written that the earth went dark for some time. Surely this couldn't have happened. How can this be borne out? Well, most of Thallus's work, like the vast majority of ancient literature, has actually been lost, although some of his writings were later quoted by Sextus Julius Africanus. And he wrote the Chronographiae, a history of the world in 5 volumes, and said this: on the whole world there pressed a fearful darkness, and the rocks were rent by an earthquake, and many places in Judea and other districts were thrown down. Thallus calls this darkness an eclipse of the sun in the 3rd book of Histories, without reason, it seems to me. Now, why would he write that? Because, he reasoned quite correctly, it couldn't have been an eclipse given the fact that crucifixion occurred at a period when there couldn't have been an eclipse. And why is that? Well, this is actually, funny enough, borne out by NASA, who did a study using astral charts of some 5,000 years worth of time from around 3000 BC to 2000 AD. And the reason it couldn't have been an eclipse, according to Sextus, was that Passover, which is when Jesus was crucified on the eve of Passover, occurs when there is a full moon. And when the moon is on the opposite side of the earth from the sun, there cannot be, obviously, an eclipse. They're both in completely different sides. And this is why, yay. And then Phlegon goes on to say, who's a Greek author, the greatest eclipse of the sun, and that it became night in the 6th hour of the day, as the gospel says, at noon, so that stars even appeared in the heavens. There was a great earthquake in Bithynia, and many things were overturned in Nicaea. Now, you've seen also the fact that there was an earthquake, and that was also clearly referred to in the accounts of the crucifixion. And the temple was rent in two, the curtain of the temple was rent in two, of the Holy of Holies. So what happened there? Clearly it wasn't an eclipse, but obviously it was a divine occurrence, given that historians have attested to it. What about Paul? Well, he refers to the fact, and Paul's writings are the earliest in the New Testament, so this is why it's worth looking at them, and they make some very significant references to the life of Jesus. He attests to the fact that Jesus was a descendant of David, was the Messiah, was betrayed, tried, crucified, and buried for our sins, rose again on the third day, and was seen by many people, including James, the cousin of Jesus, who hadn't believed in him prior to his crucifixion. Quite an interesting one, that, because James, being Jesus' cousin, would have brought great shame on the family for actually not believing in his cousin, who was a very revered rabbi. But Paul does mention some of the things that are highly significant, Jesus's parables and miracles. And he focuses not so much on those, he doesn't mention those things, he focuses on Jesus' atoning for death and resurrection, which were for him, having encountered the resurrected Jesus, not actually on earth, but in an apparition. That was what he focused on the most. And they transformed Paul from being a persecutor to being actually history's foremost Christian missionary. He was willing to go through all kinds of hardships and deprivation because of his faith. So fired up was he after that apparition of Jesus. He also corroborates some very important aspects of the character of Jesus, namely his humility, obedience, love for sinners, and so on. So the fact that Paul, who was a persecutor of Christians and an Orthodox Jew, who then began to worship all of a sudden Jesus as God from a very, very early date, this is extremely significant from a historian's point of view. Something must have caused that. We'll go on to look at that later in the presentation. Not this section, but in another video. If we compare Christianity to other religions, and we look at Zoroastrianism, for example, it's thought that the Gathas, which are kind of hymns of Zoroaster, date back from around 1000 BC, but they actually weren't written down until after the 3rd century. Then you have Buddhism, where Gautama Buddha actually lived in the 6th century BC, but his writings or biography were not actually put into writing until the 1st century AD, 700 years later. And then Islam, you're talking about a gap of around 135 years after the death of Muhammad, before his biography was written. Okay. So what about the scientific evidence? Now, I like this section because, as I said, frequent accusations or claims have been made that, Christianity just was built up on the basis of other religions. They just built their churches on the sites of mosques and other temples, ancient temples, and it's just a passing fad. It can't possibly be true. It was a theological document, not a historical one. Well, let's see if that's the case. Does scientific evidence confirm or contradict Jesus' biographies? Well, here's another expert, John McCrae, amply qualified as an archaeologist. He's actually consulted for the National Geographic, professor of New Testament and archaeology at Wheaton. His articles appeared in 17 encyclopedias, and he's actually personally supervised excavations in Israel, in the Holy Land. So, does archaeology affirm or undermine the specific details in the accounts of the New Testament? Let's see, that's in Spanish, but let's see how precise Lucas is as a historian. The general consensus of both liberal and conservative scholars is that Luke was erudite and eloquent. His Greek approached classical quality, and archaeological discoveries are showing over and over again that Luke is accurate in what he has to say. In fact, one prominent archaeologist carefully examined Luke's references to 32 countries, 54 cities, and 9 Mediterranean islands, finding not a single mistake. He also lists 95 people by name, 62 of which are not named elsewhere in the New Testament. No mistakes. In addition, Luke is intimately familiar with the constantly changing political conditions of the Roman world. He makes references to Augustus, Tiberius, Claudius, Quirinius, the Herods, Felix, and Festus. And in not one of these citations either is there a single error. Then you have a study by Sir William Ramsay, who was not a fan of Luke at all at the beginning. As a leading New Testament scholar and archaeologist, he initially doubted Luke's reliability. But after many years of on-site study of these issues, he eventually classified the beloved physician as one of the very greatest historians who ever lived. There's Philip Schaff, who actually observed that the final 2 chapters of Acts have provided more information about the details of ancient sea navigation than any other document of antiquity. This uncanny accuracy puts the Bible the biblical record in a class of its own. And then you have to ask, if Luke was so painstakingly accurate in his historical reporting, on what basis would we assume he would be any less accurate regarding matters far more important, not only to him, but to others as well? What about the reliability of John? Well, after some doubts, because there wasn't enough proof, there have been several discoveries in recent years that have shown John to be highly accurate. And one of the most recent ones was the Pool of Bethesda, because the Bible makes reference in the section on the chapter on the cripple of Bethesda. It talks about 5 porticos at the Pool of Bethesda. Well, this was recently excavated to a depth of 12 meters below ground, and there were indeed 5 porticos exactly as described. And this has actually been replicated in terms of the Pool of Siloam, referenced in John 9:7, Jacob as well, in John 4:12, and Gabbatha. I actually had the great fortune to stand on that very pavement this year, where it is thought that Jesus stood before Pilate. So this also challenges the allegations that the Gospel of John was written so long after Jesus that it can't possibly be accurate. Remember, we were initially talking about liberal dating in the 90s, but probably it was a lot earlier that, going maybe as far back as the 60s or 70s. And the important point here is that archaeology has not produced anything that is equivocally a contradiction to the Bible. This is a nice section here. The Dead Sea Scrolls. In 1947, hundreds of manuscripts dating from 250 BC to AD 68 were found in caves 20 miles east of Jerusalem. Apparently, they had been hidden by a strict sect of Jews called the Essenes or Essenians before the Romans destroyed their settlement. Jesus actually is not at all specifically mentioned in any of these scrolls, which primarily give insight into Jewish life and customs. So why is it interesting? Because there is a very interesting development involving a manuscript called 4Q 521 that could tell us something about who Jesus was claiming to be. So in the Gospel of Mark, he tells us how John the Baptist, who was imprisoned by Herod at the time and wrestling with lingering doubts about Jesus' identity, sends out his followers, his disciples, to ask Jesus the monumental question, which is this: are you the one who is to come, or shall we look for another? And he obviously means the Messiah. How does Jesus respond? He doesn't say yes or no. He says, go back and report to John what you hear and see. The blind receive sight, the lame walk, those who have leprosy are cured, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, and the good news is preached to the poor. Quite an enigmatic response. That is a reference to Isaiah 35. And for some reason, Jesus includes the phrase, the dead are raised, which is why it's marked in black, which is not present in any of the versions of Isaiah that we have seen. However, and that's the fragment, there is in the Dead Sea Scrolls a version of Isaiah that includes that missing phrase, the dead are raised. So in fact, since that segment or prophecy of Isaiah was unquestionably embedded in a messianic context, it refers to the wonders that the Messiah will do when he comes and when heaven and earth will obey him. Jesus was not being ambiguous at all. John would have instantly recognized his words as a distinct claim that Jesus was the Messiah. So, what about is the most correct of any book upon the earth? Archaeology has repeatedly failed to substantiate its claims about events that supposedly occurred long ago in the Americas. And as authors John Ankerberg and John Weldon concluded in the book on the topic, and you can see just how much it is missing in fact. In other words, no Book of Mormon cities have ever been located. No Book of Mormon person, place, nation, or name has ever been found. No Book of Mormon artifacts, no Book of Mormon scriptures, no Book of Mormon inscriptions, nothing, which demonstrates the Book of Mormon is anything other than myth or invention has ever been found. But the story is totally different when you get to the New Testament. Those who know the facts now recognize that the New Testament must be accepted as a remarkably accurate source book. What about the identity evidence? Well, for that, you're going to have to tune in to part 3 of the series on the case for Christ. Thank you very much for joining me.